Alright guys, so today we're going to be taking a look at a few different maps and understanding the furthest absolute point that the German armies advanced into the Soviet Union during Operation Barbarossa. When it comes to the answer of this question, this was a question that I wondered back when I was 15 or 16. The answer is a little bit more complicated. Now, technically, the farthest that Germany got in terms of the furthest east happened in 1942, not during the initial stages of Operation Barbarossa. The reported date was October 1st, 1942. The location, Stalingrad, where one of the most brutal German defeats happened, where the entire city was surrounded and a lot of German soldiers froze to death, completely stymieing their offensive. I do want to do another video discussing Operation Barbarossa, why the Nazis invaded when they did, and the question, what if they would have launched a spring campaign, maybe launching Barbarossa in March or April, and then you've got 2 or 3 extra months to work with before it gets freezing cold, rather than going in June, possibly do a hypothetical on that. So if you want to be absolutely technical about it, the furthest they got was when they pushed more southern into Stalingrad, Russia. Now, in terms of Moscow, the initial push had them on the outskirts of Moscow, and I remember reading that a lot of the German soldiers on the Central Front, which reached the outskirts of Moscow in the suburbs, and they could see the parliament buildings within Moscow, and I always thought to myself how crazy that would be. You know, you're a German soldier, you launch this crazy offensive against the Soviet Union, one of the most powerful countries, and you're just marching through Russia, and you see the capital city, and at that point you probably think this is just standard operation. You know, we're going to take over Moscow, Stalin is going to move the capital or whatever, and we're just going to take over Russia. I mean, I'm sure there were a lot of very confident Nazi Germany soldiers heading when they were on the outskirts of Moscow, looking into Moscow at all of the big buildings, and I envision them, you know, a lot of the German soldiers sitting there at night, seeing all the buildings lit up, and, you know, at that point, the initial stage of Barbarossa was going very well, and it's just interesting, kind of a snapshot of history and how crazy that war changed over time. And with the winter, on December 2nd, it was reported that a recon battalion of a German infantry division arrived and were able to see the domes of the towers of the Kremlin. While they waited for support until the next morning, they were pushed back. That is just a crazy thought. They were able to see the domes of the towers of the Kremlin. Remarkable. Here you can see a map of the southern Nazi advance into Russia and into Stalingrad. And again, if you're talking about the furthest, I guess technically, at least according to this map, the furthest they got was a little bit lower than Stalingrad in terms of the most far west. But again, it's a loaded question, because when you talk about the absolute furthest, you might consider Moscow the furthest because it is closest to the capital and it's very important in terms of strategics. The Army Group North did advance to Leningrad, but they were unable to capture it. Another famous area that Nazi Germany pushed into was the Caucasus Mountains, which happened after the initial Barbarossa invasion, and at that point, it was pretty much known that Nazi Germany was not going to be taking over Russia. Stalingrad was completely surrounded, and the Battle of Moscow was certainly a lot different than the Battle of Berlin, fought mainly on the outskirts of Moscow to the west instead of actually in the city. There are some crazy photos of Moscow and all of those troops marching, and just the amount of sheer manpower that the Soviet Union had to defeat Nazi Germany. There was a crazy audio recording of Adolf Hitler in his everyday voice in the mid-1940s, probably 43 or 44, talking about how shocked he was at just the sheer numbers that the USSR had. Now, they weren't all trained, but they just kept throwing bodies at Nazi Germany. And that's another reason why Barbarossa failed, along with the horrible winter and the fact that invading Russia, if you are Germany, it's a very hard task considering how outnumbered you're going to be, even if you have the advantage in terms of the experience and the kind of better quality soldier. You're facing the USSR on their land, you're completely outnumbered, and you're also dealing with the terrible cold elements. I remember doing research and looking at how bad the winter was during Barbarossa, and apparently it was actually even worse than a standard Russian winter, but I'll do a separate video talking about that. Another thing about Operation Barbarossa, if you're looking at modern day borders, well, I guess technically the modern day borders are at least disputed right now with the Russian-Ukraine war, but in general, looking at the land that Germany gained in Barbarossa, if you look at the modern day borders of Russia, they really didn't get very far into Russia because the Soviet Union was so massive and controlled so many Eastern European countries. Nazi Germany had to go through all of that, and then they finally got into what is modern day Russia. This map depicts the initial stages of Barbarossa. You can see the Nazis mainly focusing on the north in their initial push. By the way, if you're American, that date reads July 7th, not April 7th, if you're confused by that. But yeah, that's July 7th. So even in like less than a month span, that's how much land they were already able to take. Here's an interesting hypothetical. Let's say that Nazi Germany wanted to take Moscow as fast as possible. Could they do it? I would say, honestly, yes, they could. Now, it really wouldn't matter because they would be leaving both their northern and southern flanks open. But hypothetically, technically, based on how successful Barbarossa was early on, they could do it. And I will say, even though they got very close to Moscow, again, the Battle of Moscow was mainly fought on the western outskirts of the city. It wasn't really a battle within Moscow. It wasn't like the buildings got damaged or anything like that. They were really never threatening to take over the city. They just didn't have the manpower in comparison to the USSR. But either way, guys, that is going to do it for this video. Make sure you follow me on X. Link to that's always in the description.